Good morning, guys. My name's James White. I'm the Managing Director here at Media First. And welcome to this webinar, which we have titled Simplifying Your Sustainability Message and Making It Pay. And in fact, we'll kind of talk about that title in a bit when I get the guests on and see if that's an appropriate title or not, Making Sustainability Pay. So let's just start off by defining what sustainability is, which everybody's favorite website, Wikipedia, defines it as a sustainable business or a green business is an enterprise that has minimal or negative impact or potentially a positive impact on the global or local environment, community, society, or economy. Perhaps a simpler definition that I often see people quote would be something like, sustainability focuses on meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So it's not just about the environment, but it's also about the people as well, which again, we will talk more about. And in this webinar, which is more really of an online conversation, I'm going to be joined by a couple of guests. But before I introduce them and bring them onto the screen, I'm just going to do the bit that everybody sits there in a webinar as guests. All of you audience members, you sit there, you're going, okay, when's it coming? When's it coming? Where's the sales pitch? Why am I getting this for free? Why do I get to go to this Media First webinar for free? Sit tight. 20 seconds of your time is all I'm asking for, and this is it. Media First is a communications training agency. We're specialists in communications training. We do message development, we do presentations training, we do media training and crisis management training and testing. We also do a lot of leadership skills and things like that. And we've got another company, 37, that does content creation. So we're creating a lot of podcasts and things like that. That's it. Come back. If you've left the webinar just because you thought you were going to get bombarded with sales stuff, I can promise you that I've done it now. So thank you very much for listening, and go and check out our website, mediafirst.co.uk, if you want to know more. So my guests today are Mr. Tom Idle. So Tom is a podcaster, content creator, and sustainability journalist. Tom has been working and talking about sustainability for longer than most people. He's been talking about sustainability from before it became fashionable, so to speak, and before everybody else decided that it was about time we tried to save the planet. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you, James.
And we're also joined by Lisa Sanders. Lisa is the group head of comms and marketing from Kier Group. And Kier is a well-known construction company in the UK with over 10,000 employees. And amongst Lisa's team, she has a team of 7 or 8 comms professionals, as well as some regional resource around the business. So it's great to have Lisa here and get her insight from a comms perspective, and someone working within a business who has some pretty ambitious sustainability targets. I think it's fair to say that Kier has. Is that right, Lisa? we have to find her unmute button, which is Tom's job over here. There we go.
And now you can hear me. It might have been better had we just not done that, actually, but
I'd just like to catch you off guard.
Yeah.
Just like I will with my very last question of the webinar.
You have promised. So so thanks for having me. And I think we probably do have some pretty ambitious targets actually within the industry. I think it's interesting times, I think.
We'll come on to those a bit later. So I defined sustainability a moment ago. Let's get your definitions of sustainability. Tom, tell me, mate, what is how do you define sustainability in terms of business, in terms of a sustainable business? What's that look like for you?
Yeah, I'm obviously writing about the subject for lots of years, as you said at the outset, James, and now help companies sort of try and tell stories around sustainability. So defining what it is something that kind of is something we talk about a lot. And I often ask businesses to consider 100 years from now, look into the future. Will you be able to do what you do now in 100 years' time? So that goes from everything from obviously environmental impacts and whether your customers will accept you polluting and pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, through to the way that you treat your people and your suppliers. So that's how I define it. I think the sort of term sustainable business is a bit of a non-entity in that there's probably not a sustainable business that exists right now. There are kind of, ever decreasing or increasing, more sustainable businesses out there. So it's a bit of an odd one, but and I try to, tell companies to avoid the S word at all costs, really. But that's kind of how I sort of look at sustainability in terms of definition.
And by that, just to be clear, you're saying there aren't any sustainable businesses out there because ultimately the businesses themselves don't really need to exist. We don't need to travel, or we don't need to buy the clothes, or build the buildings, or whatever it is. Is that what you're saying?
That's right, and every business does have an impact, whether that's environmentally or socially. So yeah, I think there is not a company out there that can actually describe themselves as sustainable right now.
What if you discourage your customers from using the word, the S word? What words do you replace that with then?
Well, I think if you can describe something you're doing or selling or purchasing or whatever as being sustainable, I think what do we actually mean by that? We what they mean is it's more sustainable than something different. So I always sort of try to encourage them to come back to looking at benefits and values to the range of different stakeholders. What is it you're actually delivering that is of value? Whether that's to the environment and the planet, or whether it's to customers or whatever it might be. So sort of classic sales messaging, really, focus on the benefit and the value. The word "it's sustainable" just often is just a little bit. It just doesn't really cut it often.
Yeah. So it's showing as opposed to telling, isn't it? It's
exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah. Lisa, how does Kier define sustainability? What's it look like within Kier?
We've moved away actually from kind of looking at it as an environmental specialism, and kind of pulled it really into what we call a business critical mindset. So it's in our purpose as a company actually to be able to sustainably deliver infrastructure. So it really is absolutely at the heart of everything that we do. We split our sustainability framework actually, which we launched back in June of last year, into two elements, into both the environmental and the social sustainability of it, so that actually we can break it down and as you were saying, Tom, clearly show and demonstrate what we're doing in those areas, rather than just it being kind of one overarching message.
And I mean, within that, then you've got the environmental aspects, but you start talking about the social responsibility. What does that look like at Kier? How does that work?
Well, we work across the UK. I mean, the amount of, we always sort of say we've got probably maybe 400 projects on site at any one time. So pretty much anywhere you are in the UK, we are somewhere. And anything that we're doing, whether that's from, building a school, hospital, maintaining a building somewhere, actually doing something that's kind of larger scale infrastructure, we will have an impact on the communities in which we operate. And so therefore, social sustainability for us really is extremely key, because actually we need to be making sure that all of those impacts that we have on those communities are positive. and that we're giving something back as well as just providing them with a service or a building or something along those lines, but actually going that extra mile with them.
You kind of describe it in a way that, you know, sustainability or corporate social responsibility, or, you know, whatever it is that it's called, is now kind of an inherent part of the business.
Yeah.
And kind of underpins everything that you do. But how long would you say it's been like that? And apologies, Lisa, I'm not sure how long you've been there, whether or not you saw that shift. And do you, you know, what's the motivation behind that? Why do you think it has?
Well, I've been with Kier 7 years, and I think actually when I first came into the business, speaking to people who are actually, you know, delivering these services and these projects, that really is their motivation behind, quite honestly, everything. Like we have such a huge, and it was at the time known as corporate social responsibility, and I think it's kind of transitioned within Kier to kind of being known more as sustainability. And I actually think that, you know, we never really brought the two together, the environmental and the social. It's so ingrained in people that we struggle sometimes in unearthing those examples that you talk about, Tom, to be able to show exactly what we're doing, because it's so normalized that people just say, well, that's what I do as a job. That's just what I do. That's just, they don't see it as being exceptional. And even though some of these stories are really kind of small, you know, they are exceptional in their own right. It doesn't have to be something huge, ginormous initiative that you've got going, that you're gonna, you're gonna impact tens of thousands of people or something. It can just be something really quite small and quite tangible.
Guys, I'm just going to point out to anybody watching at the moment, you can ask questions in this. I should have said it at the start. Apologies. If you go down the bottom of your screen, I think you've got a questions box there. When you publish the questions, they come in, and you can jump on there and you can actually upvote those questions as well. So I can see Abby's popped a question in there. I'll go and take a look at that a bit later on. And if you see a question in there that you like, even if you don't have a question you want to ask yourself, go and check them out. You can upvote them. The more votes they get, the higher up the screen they're going to be, and the more likely it is that you'll get a response to that question live during this webinar. So, Tom, what do you see as the main driver to businesses wanting to? I'm struggling to not use the S word now, mate. This is terrible.
Good.
You've done me. I'm like,
yeah. I mean, the word better is usually a bit naff, and I try to avoid that. But essentially, it's about businesses becoming better. Yeah, I mean, it's evolved. It's evolved over the years. And I think right now, I mean, you've only got to see what's happening at the COP26 meeting at the moment, which I think there's more banks there than any other types of businesses right now. So the money's flowing. And I think at the moment, the investors are having a real influence. Their focus on ESG, environmental, social governance issues, is a real thing, driven by new regulation coming in, and that's going to put pressure on companies to kind of up their game, and that will trickle down. That will trickle down. I mean, I've just started work with a big dairy company who are right at the start of their journey in terms of getting their story straight, going through a whole materiality assessment, working out what are the things they should really focus on. And really, the only reason they're doing it is because their biggest customer wants them to do it. They're asking them, we need you to have a carbon target. Okay, so if we're going to do a carbon target, we might as well look at everything else. And that's kind of what's slowly driving everything. So investors down to big businesses, and eventually it'll lead into the supply chain, which is starting to happen, which is great. So that's what I'm seeing at the moment.
And I mean, that sounds, it comes back to the title of the webinar, making sustainability pay.
Yeah.
Is that, call us out, is that an appropriate webinar title? Because surely it's not really about making it pay. It's about just making it the world a better place, and looking after everybody's future.
It is, and I think on the more progressive end of the business community, that's always been, the reason to do things. It sounds like that's very much where you guys are coming from at Kier, Lisa. It's about your purpose and all the rest of it. But that's a big ask in terms of making sure companies all push in the same direction. So ultimately, it has to be about risk, which has driven so much over recent years. Do we have a license to operate? Are we going to get in trouble? Are we going to get killed through PR if we don't do something? And increasingly, it's about opportunity, because as much as investors are demanding and driving things, I'm not entirely convinced about the ability of consumers to really push the agenda, but they're certainly having a go. And so then it becomes about opportunity. If you're a brand that is taking this stuff seriously and your customers are kind of with you on that journey, then that's a good enough reason to get your act together. But that's been slow. I mean, we've been talking about that for 15, 20 years of, well, will the consumers get it? And now it's kind of like, the millennials or the new generation of shoppers, are they really going to sort of force the agenda? I'm not entirely convinced, but
and you're talking here about people voting with their feet and making more sustainable choices, and
but there's a big gap between intent and action. So more and more people are saying the right things. So if you ask a 15-year-old whether they care about saving the environment, they will all say yes. Whereas 30 years ago, you might have got a bit of a mixed response. But living with a 14-year-old girl in the house here, she loves going to Primark and buying fast fashion, and she won't even think about her consumption at all. I mean, why would she? So there's a long way to go in that respect. But
my 11-year-old son, I took him to with his younger brother, to a fireworks display. And at one point during the fireworks display, this last weekend, grabbed hold of me and pulled me down to his ear, and he said, "Daddy, I'm a bit worried about what the fireworks are doing to the environment. Look at all that smoke." And he really stopped enjoying the fireworks display. I had to talk him round it, but it was like, yeah, you're right. That sometimes might say the right thing, and we could all be guilty of that. But I'm sure if I turned around to either of my children and said, well, probably the best thing that we could do for the environment is stop playing Xbox, because of the cost. I'm sure I get some kickback. So there must have been a huge, rise in the amount of people talking about sustainability, or social governance, or looking after their people. And I imagine the looking after the people thing is something that has massively changed since, the pandemic, surely. We're now working from home, and, there's much more of a blend, and, there's a huge risk, isn't there, of burnout and, breakdown, and how you monitor that. And does that fit within the sustainability agenda for you guys? Is that something, Lisa, why don't you take that? Is that, that person piece, is that part of it?
Yeah, hugely. It's part of it. Actually fits into two of our kind of facets of our framework, actually, around kind of diversity, inclusion and respect, and also then employee well-being and retention. And I think I would agree with you, actually, that I think the pandemic has changed things quite significantly from a well-being arena. And I think it, particularly within construction as well. I mean, let's call it what it is. I think we've got a reputation, probably, rightly or wrongly at the moment, that it might be, pale, male and stale. And so actually having had those conversations and seeing this at the forefront of what we're saying, to get people who may not traditionally be wanting to talk about some of these things, about well-being, about kind of mental health, I think it's really positive. And that's why I don't think it's so much of a bad thing. Just coming back to just your earlier point around, I think people and companies, do see this as the right thing to do, even if they are, wherever they happen to be within their journey. I just don't necessarily think it's a bad thing at all that you've got then investors, clients, customers, the general public, consumers actually pushing for it as well, because surely it will push those companies who are already doing things in possibly to go even further, and at least then it stimulates other people into action entirely. So.
There's
I'm seeing loads of stuff about well-being, whether it's in offices looking after people's mental health, particularly since COVID. But really, I mean, it's quite a useful lens to talk about the S word in terms of looking after people, because if you look after people wherever that happens to be, often things just kind of fall in line. And if you look after people in the Amazon who you're sourcing palm oil from, and you pay them fairly, there's a much better chance they won't be causing deforestation. It's a very simplified sort of example, but you get the point. If you look after people, often sustainability takes care of itself.
It's almost like the new look after the pennies and the pounds will look after themselves. It's like look after the people and the planet will look after itself.
Yeah,
you can have that one for free, mate. So Kia, I mentioned at the start, Lisa, got some pretty bold ambitions, haven't you, in terms of your sustainability credentials? And you've already said, you're in. I guess it's fair to say, the construction industry is probably a few years behind many companies and many industries. Is that, when it comes to sustainability, is that fair?
Yeah, I think that definitely in pockets of, there are elements where we are behind. So.
Yeah. And so what does that mean for you in terms of your targets, though? Because is your ambition then to try and kind of leapfrog and kind of get back ahead?
I think we have to be realistic with our targets. They're ambitious, but they're realistic.
Okay.
And so we've committed that actually, we will be carbon neutral in our own operations and through our supply chain by 2045.
Yeah.
But then coming back and saying, actually, it will be within our own operations by 2039. And I think it's important that we're as transparent as we can be on those things, because I think you can quite easily put out one big target that says we will do X by X, but actually what's the detail behind that, and how does that take it, particularly within carbon impact, how does that take into account scopes 1, 2 and 3, and some of that is then scratching the surface if you're not really kind of being transparent and saying, no, this is exactly how we're actually going to do it and by when.
And Tom, how do you feel about, you said right at the outset that there's not really such a thing as a sustainable business. Do you know what I mean? If you look at it from a purist perspective, but how do you feel about any company who, on the face of it, you go, well, IKEA or L'Oreal or whoever, whatever example, Nike, Adidas, Nestle, whoever you bring to the table, you go, these are beacons of sustainability, or some of those are, but it's if they're telling you sustainable stories and trying to get your attention with a sustainable story, how do you balance that in your head by going, yeah, but it's they're producing this and it's not required. How does that?
Yeah, it's really easy to be cynical working in this space, because you do ask those questions, and even a target in construction about carbon neutrality. There's going to be some offsetting and all the rest of it, and there's only so much you can influence, as you rightly say, Lisa. So you do question those things, but I'm always happy to hear stories where companies are being completely upfront, transparent about what the limitations are, about what they're trying to achieve, recognizing that there's loads more that can be done and will be done, but that's not to discourage them from telling those stories. And I think that's the important bit. And also just keeping it simple. I don't know about what your sort of stakeholders think right now, Lisa, about when you talk about the different scopes. Has there been a kind of jump in understanding about this sort of terminology, or are you still trying to educate? And how have things moved on for you when you're talking to people?
I think there's still a massive part of education to be done on this one as well. And that's why I think you have to be transparent with it, because it's just so easy not to be. Because you can talk about things at a real kind of top level, and actually, because then people don't necessarily understand all the terminology that comes beneath it, you can gloss over things quite easily. And I just don't think that that's I mean, it's not a long-term communications message. You can do some of that short term, but actually, you know, if you really want to make impact, then the story has got to be as simple as it can be for every level of audience that you're speaking to. And I mean, I always think, if I can possibly explain it to my 9-year-old, then that's really the kind of level of language that I should be using.
Yeah, ultimately it's called mass communication for a reason, isn't it? You know, you've got to be able to communicate to a wide audience, and simplifying that message and making it clear is really important.
Yeah, and often transparency is about trying to fill in the gaps, because if you leave blanks in your narrative, then questions will be asked, accusations of greenwash, things like that. So I would encourage companies to really sort of try to fill the gaps, explain why you've only gone so far. And I think that will go down much better with your audience, because they can look at it and go, well, do you know what? There's a level of honesty there and openness that I can accept. And the story still stacks up because you've also given me what you're not doing. And that is often the missing part when companies fall into kind of greenwashing and trying to, you know, grab quick PR wins with this stuff, which is really easy to do. It's really kind of attractive for companies because of all the things we said at the outset. The value, the opportunity around some of these issues we're talking about is so easy to fall into that trap in trying to chase quick wins PR wise, without having your whole story kind of scoped out and stacking up.
It's interesting. I mean, you guys will know this, and any of our customers who are, you know, online at the moment will be familiar with the AMEN acronym, which is an acronym that we encourage people to use during media training, which is understanding your audience, figuring out what your message is, backing that message up with an example, and then preparing for the negative as well. And, you know, in our crisis management training, we do the same. You know, if you leave a void, it will be filled. So it is, as Tom's just said there, you know, preparing that message, identifying what the negative is, or just being realistic and open and transparent about, look, this is where we are at the moment. You know, I think there is a general recognition out there that these problems are massive, and, you know, the sustainability or you know, the social responsibility of looking after each other is a huge thing, and it's really challenging, and it's not easy, and it's not going to be solved by any one company. And you know, I think people will respect that, won't they? I'm sure there will become a time when it's a case that, you know, everybody's doing it, and if you're not, then it's like, okay, guys, you know, really, you know. But I think at the moment we're very much at probably, you know, quite at the start of that journey, aren't we, towards 2050, or at least we've got. I won't say we've got time, because we don't, but, you know, we've. There's a long way to go. It's a long journey. You'd mentioned greenwashing there, Tom. Lisa, have you ever been, you know, fearful of being accused of greenwashing when you're talking, you know, promoting sustainability stories?
Yeah, I think anybody who's been asked to say something on sustainability, yes, very much so. I think I'm just naturally quite generally nervous, and I think I tend to ask all the questions, which you know, may or may not be it may be a good thing or a bad thing, but I think we do need to have confidence in telling stories that, you know, some things may come and bite us in a few years' time or something, but actually, as long as you're saying with your AMEN acronym, as long as you can back up what you're saying and what you're doing with examples now, then you can't necessarily determine what's going to happen in however many years' time.
Yeah. So your kind of due due diligence as a team? You know, if someone comes to you with a story, you know, have you ever had a story kind of put underneath your nose from within the business, and maybe not at Kia, but where you know, someone's asked you to promote a story and gone, oh, can we put a bit more of a sustainability spin on that, please?
Yeah, where it possibly naturally doesn't have so much of a sustainable. I think that's that's when it just doesn't work, though, because unless it is a true sustainability story, then whichever audience you happen to be trying to reach with it is going to see through it quite quickly. It has to be a true sustainability story.
Tom, what are the sustainability stories that kind of really catch your eye?
I going back to kind of this notion of authenticity, that tends to really sort of grab me. When companies come out and sort of declare that, you know, they've done something good, but they're backing it up by saying that we've still got more to do. I mean, the dairy company I mentioned I'm working with at the moment, you know, addressing that elephant in the room about, you know, the impact of dairy farming, which is, you know, absolutely catastrophic from a sort of greenhouse gas emission point of view. So being upfront about that before leading into kind of what you're doing about it. And then, okay, so what are you doing about it? Does that really sort of stack up in terms of the scale of where we're going and what needs to be achieved? What is it you're doing that actually adds to that and negates that? So I'm always kind of looking at, okay, so what does that really mean? But I think companies that are more upfront about the challenge and you know, and recognizing the scale of the challenge, they're the stories that really grab my attention, really. And also, you know, doing things different. I mean, there's lots of great examples of startups out there that are really, you know, whether they're focused on, you know, circular design or tackling the climate agenda. But you know, if they're doing more than kind of just turning the dial and they're trying to transform things, that often excites me as well. Where they're ripping up the rule book and saying, look, there's a much better way of doing this. And yeah, I mean, an ultra kind of transparency where you're really sort of, you know, diving in. They know exactly where their ingredients are coming from. They've kind of traced them all back to the mills or the farms or whatever it might be. That again is something that I always look out for as well, because that shows they've done that homework and they've really sort of, they know where their impacts are. They're working out their priorities and they've got a good story to tell.
Do you think that there's an opportunity for businesses to work together more on their sustainable story?
Yeah.
Or just on their sustainable credentials, actually, not just the story, but their sustainable credentials?
Yeah, there is. And there's more and more good examples. I'm working with a bunch at the moment. They're called Action for Sustainable Derivatives. And there's a whole bunch of cosmetics companies. So you mentioned before, L'Oreal, Avon, Body Shop, all the big guys. As individual businesses, they don't source much palm oil. So they have very little influence in changing the supply chain. But they all kind of source from roughly the same sort of areas of the world. So collectively, and there's I think about 25 in the group now, they're clubbing together, all putting some money into a pot to then improve their transparency as a collective. And again, you know, as a group, they're much more influential in trying to change behaviors. And that's from, you know, environmental impacts through to social impacts. So I think as a group, they're doing some really interesting things. And yeah, and I'm helping them with their sort of messaging and communications in the project. So yes, strategically, it's a great project to be involved in, but actually it gives them a way of communicating about the impact they can have. And actually, as individual companies, they can't have much impact at all, but together they can. And that's just one of, I mean, hundreds and hundreds. I mean, you guys at Kia must be a part of some of these collaborations, but there's more and more examples of that actually working quite well.
Yeah, I think actually we've got to all work together, particularly within construction, when we talk about the impact of how we need to work with our supply chain to make sure that, you know, we make the greatest impact. Like us, along with anybody else within the industry, we're all pretty much working with the same people. So
Yeah.
if us as Kia turn around and say to one of our supply chain members, well, this is the target and this is how you're going to have to help us do this, and then they've got the same thing from 5-6 other companies, how are they ever going to be able to try and cut through it themselves and figure out how they really can make an impact? I think actually it would be much more beneficial if we worked together, to particularly on those kind of instances. It doesn't mean that we don't have to have our own targets and there's not things that we can't do ourselves, but having a kind of a common goal would be beneficial, I think.
That's the fact that sustainability is such a huge worldwide jigsaw puzzle, is it means you've got to work together to address some of these concerns, haven't you? Tom, we were doing a podcast together recently, and with a client of ours, and they made an interesting point. I was editing it yesterday actually, and it kind of caught my ear again, and it was saying about how there's a risk that developed countries are at risk of kind of saying, we've had our fun, we've done all this, and we're going to be turning around to developing companies and going, but now you can't do it because it's not environmentally friendly for you to do all of this, and you can't build this massive infrastructure because actually that's not, the environmentally friendly way of doing it. What's your thoughts on that, mate? Is that something that you
I mean, that's pretty much the reason why every UN COP meeting has ended in failure, because you got that constant toing and froing about who pays the bill, who picks up the tab for the state of the world right now. And I think what will change that is kind of your electorate suddenly not accepting the way things have always been. On a business level, that's consumers turning to alternative options, which has also meant legacy businesses that have been around for 100 years slowly starting to buy up some of those really smart startup companies. I mean, good example. I think L'Oreal bought The Body Shop. I know Body Shop wasn't a startup, but it was certainly a purpose-led business, and L'Oreal ate them up. There's hundreds of examples like that of big businesses buying small, but I think that's being led by consumers wanting something different. But on a sort of global scale of developed versus developing, I think as soon as you get an electorate that won't stand for it, and I mean, I don't know whether we're actually there yet, and we're slowly edging towards that, but we're quite a long way off that. But that will certainly change the conversation without doubt.
Are there any examples of businesses going out of business? You call them legacy businesses. They're obviously, if they've got the capital and the foresight, they're buying up, some of these companies to try and, protect themselves as a business entity. But any examples of them actually going out of business?
Not from a purely sustainability point of view. I mean, no. I mean, so far it's been largely economics that have seen some of these businesses go away. But I suppose the fundamentals of why they've gone out of business, you could argue that it was about not following the market trends, consumers wanting something different. And I think as we see the consumers shift into, well, I'm not going to buy from that company because they're not looking after their people or protecting the planet, we will start to see that. So it's interesting. It's a good, interesting question actually, because I can't really think of any that have gone out of business purely because they're not being, they're not being responsible or doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think in time it will happen, won't it? It's interesting you mentioned L'Oreal and knowing that they're a forward-thinking company. I jumped on their website before this webinar a couple of days back, and they've got 10 news stories on their homepage, 7 of which are all kind of in that sustainability or people space. So those headlines, just to give you some ideas, were supporting the restoration of mangroves in Kenya, raising awareness around men's health, rebuilding wildlife diversity in the UK. What does diversity, equality, and inclusion mean? L'Oreal ranked in Fortune's Change the World list an initiative to stop online bullying, and there was another initiative about empowering young women. You know, 7 of the 10 top stories on a cosmetics website, you know, are seemingly all about wildlife and mental health.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's fascinating and amazing actually that we've got to that point, because I mean these guys are smart comms teams. They must be looking at all the data all the time, and it just shows that, you know, their audience is more aware and interested in this stuff than ever before. Yeah, it's amazing. Really, we've got to this point. It's exciting, really.
Yeah, it is exciting. Really exciting. I'll tell you what's also exciting is we've got about 5 pages of audience questions here. So I'm going to sit back and let them take the lead for a bit. When are we going to be able to do like video-based questions, Tom, so that like people can just, you know, jump in and I can just drink my tea? Let me have a little look and see what we've got. I'm going to scroll to the top. Right. Okay. So I'm going to take a bit of a snapshot in terms of when they were voted. So, what facts and figures should we be using when we're talking about sustainability? That's got 11 upvotes, and this was, you know, put on quite early on in the webinar. But what measurements, I guess, is the question. You know, how do you measure your sustainability success, or CSR? Lisa, what do you guys measure at Kier?
We use a number of different tools, actually. We've just brought in a new social value calculator. Actually, there's a number of people out there who will offer, you know, all different types of measurement. I think it's quite a long process, obviously, but you've got to look at what your framework and what your targets are, and then find a provider out there who actually will be able to kind of help you on that journey and help you measure it. I don't think there's kind of a one size fits all. This is how you measure something. I think it's got to be on an individual basis.
Yeah, Tom.
It's got to be not just about what you're measuring; it's about why you're measuring it. You know, and so often you find that, well, you know, we've got, I don't know, X number of mental health, you know, first aiders now in the company. Okay, so what does that mean? Why does that prepare you better as a business, you know, better this year than last? So I think that's often the missing part. And also just using, you know, the most appropriate metrics that you can keep coming back to, so you can show how things are progressing over the years. But you're right. I mean, every business will be looking at something different, I guess.
It's an interesting example you've just chosen, you know, around, you know, X number of, you know, trained first aiders. You know, that kind of fits into this whole sustainability definition that you gave it at the start, which is, you know, being around in the next 100 years, I guess. It's and looking after your people. But I find it fascinating that that's the kind of example that you go to as a sustainability journalist. It's things like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's just centre of mind, because it seems to kind of, especially this year, people talking about their year of COVID and what that's done to their workforce, and then how they're then preparing for the future because they can see the trend, and then also what that means, you know, to look after people in terms of their mental health and safety was always the thing. Let's stop people dying on site. Let's make sure there's no injuries. Let's make sure there's no lost time, you know, on construction sites or whatever it might be. But now it's kind of like, okay, so how do we look after people a bit longer term? And what does that mean for productivity? You know, the happiness of the workforce, the ability to retain and recruit, measuring how long people are staying within companies. And it's all these things slowly building that, well, you must be, you know, doing this all the time, Lisa, I guess.
Yeah, we've got quite a contingent of mental health first aiders, and that's been going for quite a few years. In fact, possibly before I even started at Kier, we've had the, you know, training. I think something like you know, something like 900 people we've trained since we started, which, you know, is a big, you know, amount of people to, and they're
10% of your workforce, yeah.
And they're easily identifiable as well. You know, simple things like special lanyards that they can wear, so that you know that if you're on a site or in an office or something, actually you know that you've got somebody that you can go and talk to. So it's I mean, it seems like quite a simple thing to be able to do, but these people have to go through a fair bit of training to become first aider.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? As well, it comes back to, again, this is something that Tom and I see a lot when we're working on customer podcasts, is that kind of preparing for a volatile world, preparing for the unknown, and being your readiness to be able to deal with it, whether it's internal, people's mental health or whatever it might be, and we don't know, if the pandemic's over. We don't know if there's going to be a future pandemic, and I think we've learned a lot as businesses in the last few years, that allows us to be better prepared for the future and be better prepared for more, these kind of events, I guess. I'm sure there's been plenty of changes, Lisa, at Kier, have there not, over the last few years, in terms of how, if the pandemic were to start again, I'm sure you'd be much better placed to deal with it.
That's probably one of the things that you can never really prepare for in a risk register, is it? Global pandemic. So yeah. Well,
I mean, I guess we can now because it's happened, but certainly beforehand there was no planning for it whatsoever, was there? But I guess we now have some idea of what it might look like and how it could impact businesses. So yeah, it's possible, I guess, now. Mark Slattery, hello, Mark. I like the idea of not so much defining sustainability, but measuring your impact. How does Tom think it is best shown and presented?
I think it's about being clear and consistent in what you're saying. And I think it's about being relevant to your business and your audience. Because, you can kind of report and communicate your impact on all number of things, but actually in terms of prioritizing them and getting your sort of biggest bang for your buck, if you like, for me, it's about being quite strategic and saying, okay, so what's material to the business? What's the most important things we should really be talking about? And actually measuring those rather than everything, because, your list of impacts is huge. But really it's focusing on the big ones, really. I mean, it's like a mining company, for instance, always talking about the mental health of their staff rather than talking about water and greenhouse gas emissions. So you can measure all these things, but in terms of sort of messages to put out there and stories to tell, I think it's about focusing on the things that are most relevant and important.
Anne Keogh, hi Anne. My company is doing good things to help us get to carbon net zero by 2030, but as a communication person, I'm worried about any PR being labelled as greenwashing. Any tips, what accreditations or milestones we need before we are more confident about telling our story? And I think that kind of comes back to the governance piece, doesn't it? But about certification and stuff like that, if you can get that third party corroboration on the work that you've done, then that's going to give you more confidence when telling that story. Tom, is there anything in particular any advice you can particularly offer there to Anne?
Yeah, there are certifications out there, but I'd say be careful. Look into what they are and how they're kind of what metrics they're using to judge whether something is deemed to be sustainable or not. But I think it also comes back to your point, Lisa, about asking questions internally, and that might be to the detriment of your communications efforts, because you ask so many questions that you kind of either don't publish that story or you kind of run out of steam or whatever. But I think it's about asking lots of questions internally, doing your due diligence among yourselves. Actually reminds me of something we said before we came on air, which was about the impact of COVID and people not being in the office. And so many of these kind of stories you unearth as an internal team come from just chatting in the office, in meetings, before meetings, and that must be having an impact on businesses everywhere, where you've got very quite clear parameters of your meetings online, and I wonder whether that's being lost somewhat, because some of those stories are so deep in the kind of inner sanctums of businesses that they just need to be unearthed, and a lot of that comes from chatting, doesn't it?
Mm.
Yeah, we were saying, weren't we, that people. I think I was saying earlier as well that people just see this as naturally as what they do, and they don't necessarily understand what the impact is. I've been out actually. I've been really lucky over the last couple of weeks going out and doing some employee events,
Right.
and actually kind of meeting with people across the UK, and going onto some of our sites and just having a sensible conversation with people and just asking them what they're doing and how they're going about it. And suddenly all of these amazing stories kind of come out from them. And you're right. I'd have never got that off a Teams call, even if I'd set one up with a specific, I want to get your sustainability stories. There's no way in the world. It's just that just naturally through conversation, it comes up.
And a lot of that, I hear from our customers is because actually people don't necessarily really understand what makes a story, what makes a news story. And why should they? They're not necessarily communications professionals. And so they drop this golden nugget on your lap just so that, whilst you're making a cup of tea next to them. And you're like, oh my God, it's like, yeah, that's a great story, There is actually an online course that we've produced for people who can do that. It's a 10-15 minute course. So talk to your account managers, guys. Because it's well worth looking at, and that it's designed for the wider organization to teach them about what a news story is within your business. It's a branded product, so it sits within a Kia branded product, for example. But yeah, no, well worth checking that out. What are the most impactful comms techniques for communicating sustainability to mass audiences? Charles Dean, thank you very much. Who wants to take that?
I'll start. Quite happy to. I think just keeping it simple, keeping it relevant to your audience. So that does not mean it's one size fits all. If you've got different audiences within your organisation, then they need to be communicated to differently. And I think the power of repetition shouldn't be ignored either. Stuff doesn't sink in the first time that we say it, probably doesn't for the next 5 times either. But it's not around recycling the same story. It's just around making sure that actually these messages embed within organizations.
And so much of this is about talking to the heart. It's so much of sustainability communications about emotion and about human connection. And what does it mean for people? And I keep coming back to that because that seems to be driving more and more of my work. It's about people being the center of everything. So I think, about connecting with the emotion of people in what we're saying and doing.
And I think also, to take a point that both of you have made throughout this conversation is not just trying to make it appealing to a wide audience, but really kind of boiling it down and going, okay, this is how it impacts this one individual or this type of person, and being able to bring those examples as well of, here's the story of this person and how it's affected them. Whether it's, a more sustainable way of farming silk in a far-flung country or something, or, enabling, farmers' children to be educated, and with fair trade pricing and things like that. But it is those stories, isn't it, that are really the things that bring it to life.
Yeah, it is. It's being realistic about those stories and what they're achieving, but also bringing it back to the relevance to the business and also the relevance to the audience, whether that's the customer or an investor or whoever, an interested party. Relevance, I think, is crucial with that sort of stuff.
And that was a question here. I'm just trying to find it again. Where is it? It was, I'm going to paraphrase it until I find it, but it was basically saying, how do you bring your staff on the sustainability, journey? It was actually addressed, Lisa, to you, saying, how do you communicate the sustainable story to your staff and get them on board? I'll try and find it whilst you hopefully begin answering that question, if it was good enough. That sounded a terrible question. It was phrased much better. I found it. How are you getting employees truly involved in your ESG agenda at Kia? Why didn't I just say that?
by making it relevant to them. But again, I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself slightly, but just actually keeping it simple. When we launched our framework last year, we actually split it down into the two components, the environmental and the social side. And we launched the environmental side first, because otherwise that's a lot to take in one go. And so if you can break it down into kind of its component parts and actually tell the stories through over time, then, you know, I think that's of great benefit as well, to be able to actually make sure that people do then retain the information. However, if you do actually need to go out and kind of do a big, huge, here's everything all in one go, probably just to make sure again, really, that you're continually then repeating some of those messages and bringing examples to, you know, new examples through, so that it keeps it kind of timely and fresh for people.
Yeah, and I guess, although we, you know, arguably none of us here profess to be internal comms experts, you know, but definitely kind of presenting it in lots of different ways, and you know, people want that information in lots of different ways, don't they? The question here, Sarah, and I should just say, Emma, thank you very much for posing that question so much better than I could ever have tried, clearly. Sarah has said, sustainability is surrounded by so much jargon. How do we educate audiences and avoid jargon? Well, you send them on a media first course, clearly. Yeah, let's just end there, full stop, done. Melissa, who do you think is doing really well in this space? What comms examples can we look up to? Tom, you've cited some examples, haven't you already, mate? But any others?
I always like looking at what Patagonia are putting out there. I shared something on LinkedIn, actually, that you alerted to me, James, last week. That's well worth having a look. So have a look at my LinkedIn profile. It's on there, which was absolutely brilliant. I mean, their kind of, you know, anti-capitalist message is quite, you know, they come out with statements like, you know, don't buy our products unless you really want to or need to. So should I say? So they're always quite good. There's a company called Just. Actually, funnily enough, they were called Just Eat, and they changed their name because of the takeaway delivery bunch that sort of superseded them. But they were called Just Eat. I think they're just called Just now, but that's worth having a look at. They're an American startup who are trying to make different foodstuffs using alternative products. Their kind of message is that, you know, we only use a small fraction of the plants that you could actually farm to make, whether it's mayo, whatever it might be, and they're trying to find alternatives. They're really interesting, and they come up with some fantastic messaging. So they're worth having a look at. Unilever always sort of ahead of the game in this space, particularly, you know, brands like Ben and Jerry's. So worth having a look at those guys. There's lots out there. It's always difficult being put on the spot with examples, but they're ones to check out.
I think you did famously, mate. So guys, I think we're bob on an hour at the moment, and I did promise Lisa before we came on air that I would give her an "and finally" question in true kind of Paxman style. So my "and finally" question for Lisa is, can you just clear something up for me, basically? Mike Graham, Talk Radio. Is it actually possible to grow concrete?
Oh my goodness me! That was a question I could have never even thought of. I haven't got the foggiest, but I'm now really interested, and I'm going to look into it. So,
if you've not seen this story, this is Mike Graham on Talk Radio during one of his interviews, and he was having a debate with a guest who said that they were a carpenter, I think, and he basically accused the carpenter of not being very sustainable in his trade, and he said, well, wood is a very sustainable product, and kind of went on to talk about that, and Mike suggested that you could grow concrete. And then since then has spent about 2 days trying to defend his comment by saying, well, concrete expands when you mix it, so it is like growing it. But I don't think that's quite what he meant.
I don't think that's quite what he meant, but actually there are instances where we do talk about concrete being much more sustainable than wood. I mean, that's for a whole different conversation. We could go down a rabbit hole with that, but yeah.
Maybe on the next webinar, you can tell us about all of the new amazing technologies, and you'll be going, well, actually, James, we can grow concrete now. And I have this plant here. Lisa, Tom, thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. It's been fascinating talking to you both and hearing your thoughts on this massive topic. So I really appreciate you guys spending the time with us. And thank you, obviously, to all of you guys for joining us, all the audience members, and for all of your questions. I'm really sorry that we didn't get to, we scratched the surface of those questions, if I'm honest with you. And my beautiful assistant, Thomas, another Thomas, is sat here now. He keeps adding those questions in. And I'm like, mate, we're never getting to them. But thank you very much to all of you for joining us and for all those questions. And we will do our best to answer those questions for you offline. Maybe turn them into a blog and ping them out to you. So that's it from us. And thank you very much, all. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.